Chapter 20. After a day back in the city, doing nothing but worrying about Shari and the boys, Rash decided he couldn't stand to stay home any longer. There weren't any calls on the answering machine at the house. A call to the department told him he hadn't had any calls there either. So no word from Schaefer. He did call Shari's mother, from a payphone just in case, and she reported that everything was fine. Shari and the boys were there in Elmira, safe and well. Rash talked to his wife, and the sound of her voice was a relief. He reassured her that he was fine too. But he couldn't talk forever. His supply of change wouldn't hold out, and he didn't want to use a calling card, since that would leave a record. He went home, and after a day he couldn't stand it anymore. He phoned in to say he'd cut his vacation short, and would be in the next day. McComb grumbled. It was obvious he'd just as soon never see Rash again, but he could hardly argue. Then Rash went down to the police plaza and picked up a portable police radio and spent the evening installing it in the rental van, just in case. That first morning back at work was dismal. The paperwork had piled up during his absence, but he couldn't concentrate on it. He kept thinking about Shari, out there in Elmira, hours away, and he kept remembering those swaying flayed corpses on the 5th floor on Beekman Street and in the basement on 20th. And he kept having nightmare visions of Shari hanging upside down with her skin peeled off, dripping blood in slow circles on the floor of her mother's front hall. He couldn't even imagine where Schaefer might be, or what might have happened to him. Some kind of hunter, Schaefer's brother had said. But what did that mean? How was that different from any ordinary hitman? Why did this hunter skin his victims? Did he always skin his victims? And how many had there actually been? Did Rash know about all of them, or were there some the feds had managed to keep quiet? It was on the way back from lunch that Officer Brownlow caught him in the hallway. "Excuse me, sir," he said, as he brushed Rash's sleeve. "You're Detective Rash?" Rash admitted it. He'd been taking a cup of coffee back to his desk, and he sipped it, then asked, "And who are you, the Easter Bunny?" Brownlow introduced himself. "I understand you're Detective Schaefer's partner, the one who got thrown out at 20th Street? "It was the scene at Beekman where he got thrown out," Rash corrected. "At 20th Street, they just politely asked us to go away." Brownlow nodded. "Right," he said. "Well, I thought you might be interested in a couple of recent cases, sir. Nothing special, you understand. Nothing that would interest the feds, but I thought you might want to take a look." Rash stared at him over the rim of the coffee cup. "Oh? What sort of cases?" "It'd be easier to just show you the files, sir." He held up a thick sheaf of manila folders. Rash figured he wasn't going to get anything more important done anyway. He nodded, and the two men returned to Rash's office. Brownlow wouldn't tell him anything more. He left the folders on the desk and departed. Rash sighed and opened the first folder. He spent the afternoon going over the cases that Officer Brownlow and others like him in the NYPD had decided wouldn't interest the feds. Brownlow was right, though. The cases definitely interested Rash, and they answered the question he'd wondered about earlier. No, Rash saw. It seemed that the hunter hitman didn't always skin the victims, not if that was really who was responsible for these killings. But when he didn't skin them, he took their heads and spines. He didn't just detach them, he took them. None of the heads had been found anywhere. And, Rash realized, they'd never found any of the skin from the other victims. It was just gone. Heads. That wasn't unheard of. Killers had done that often enough. From ancient conquerors to sex killers, lots of people had cut off heads and then taken them as trophies. But spines. Or skins. This guy, if it was just one guy, which Rash was beginning to doubt, despite what Schaefer thought, was very weird indeed. He remembered what Schaefer had said about the fight on Beekman, that his opponent hadn't been human. Maybe Schaefer was right. Hours after his shift ended, Rash was still at his desk, but he was no longer even pretending to work. He just couldn't bring himself to leave the office. After all, where would he go? Home, to an empty house? Shari and the kids were upstate. Going home would just be depressing. It was too early to go to bed. The sun hadn't even yet set. It was one of those long summer afternoons that seemed to go on forever. And there wasn't anything to do at home but sleep, assuming he could sleep, knowing that the killer was out there somewhere, roaming the city, ripping people apart and taking pieces as souvenirs. And if Schaefer called, he'd probably call the office. At least Rash thought so, but he could never be sure. Even after 6 years, he didn't understand how Schaefer's mind worked. Sometimes Schaefer was smart and sharp and right on top of everything. And sometimes he'd be off in the Twilight Zone somewhere. And right now, he was off in Central America or Colombia or some goddamn place, and he hadn't even bothered to call in. Unless he tried calling the house while Rash was here at the office. But if he couldn't reach Rash there, he'd have tried the office. So, he hadn't tried. He was still playing it solo. Rash hated that. He was supposed to be Shade's partner. Not that he was about to fly off to Central America. He was too old and out of shape to go slogging through the jungle with Schaefer looking for monsters. And Dutch had been Schaefer's brother, not his. Rash had never even met him. He wouldn't know what he was looking for, following Dutch's trail. And Schaefer was the one who'd been Special Forces. Rash's military career had consisted of a couple of years at Fort Bragg picking up cigarette butts. If it came down to some kind of pitched battle, Rash wouldn't be much help. But Schaefer still should have called. So Rash sat in his office, ignoring the stack of unfinished reports and the case files on 36 unsolved murders, and stared at the screen of his battered old portable TV. The TV was supposed to be there in case there was some breaking news story that concerned police, but mostly it was there so Rash could watch WWOR when he didn't feel like pushing any more papers, and there wasn't anything for him to do on the streets, and he didn't want to think any more about the killings he was supposed to be investigating, or, in the present case, killings he was supposed to be ignoring. And right now WWOR wasn't coming in, no matter how much Rash fooled with the rabbit ears. Reception had been lousy for the last 2 weeks, even by New York standards. Bad enough that the local stations had done news reports in which scientists from Columbia and NYU made wild-ass guesses about sunspots and radioactive pollutants trapped by the temperature inversion. But today, the interference was worse than ever. Rash slapped the set in frustration, and Mr. Ed vanished in a blur of snow. "Shit," he said. He got up and stared around the tiny room in frustration. Maybe there was something in one of the desk drawers that he could distract himself with for a little while. He pulled one open at random. His gaze fell on a bundle stuffed into the drawer. His jacket, wrapped around the helmet mask thing that Schaefer had given him for safekeeping. The thing Schaefer had pulled off the killer's face just before being thrown out of the 5th floor of that empty building. He had forgotten it was there. He'd been too busy with other matters, like getting Schaefer to the hospital, and then to the airport, and then getting Shari out of town. He dumped it there that morning when he and Schaefer had come in, and McComb had called Schaefer into his office, the morning Schaefer had left for Central America. Neither of them had ever really looked at the thing. Maybe it was time someone did. Rash didn't expect much. It was probably just a fancy hard hat, nothing but a chunk of inert metal, but it wouldn't hurt to look. He unwrapped it. The thing looked as if it was meant to cover a face and the top of a head, but the shapes and proportions were wrong. Nobody had a face angled like that, and it was bigger than it needed to be. It was smooth grey metal, with a dull finish, but with no scratches or scars that Rash could see. The eye holes weren't just holes. They were lenses, dark glass, maybe red. Rash couldn't really be sure. He turned the mask over. The inside was lined with something he couldn't identify, something slightly spongy, slightly leathery. There were metal insets that looked as if they might be decoration, or might be something electronic. There were little tubes on either side that looked as if they were meant to connect up to something, but they weren't quite right for any of the standard plugs or connectors Rash had ever seen. And something was glowing faintly beside the left eyepiece, a small yellow shape he couldn't identify. Rash frowned. This wasn't just a mask, it was a gadget of some kind. But what did it do? He held it up to the light from the window and peered through those eye holes. Then he blinked. He lowered the mask. He saw the street, the sky awash in the orange fire of a spectacular sunset, the windows gleaming golden, the towers above the rooftops across the street shadow black to the east, midday bright to the south and west. And that was all he saw. He turned back to his office, the desk, the TV, the bookshelves. He raised the mask and saw them all, eerily changed, but still recognizable. The desk, the TV, the bookshelves, masses of strange colour that seemed to vibrate. The mask changed what he saw, somehow, like those night vision scopes the military used. Infrared, was it? Whatever it was, he was still seeing what was really there. It wasn't some sort of computer simulation. He held the mask up to his face. He couldn't put it on. His head wasn't big enough, wasn't the right shape, but he could hold it so that he saw out through the eye holes. Desk, TV, bookshelves, chair, door, lamp, the TV antenna like blue lines of light, the TV itself hot pink. He could even read his own name backward on the glass of the door, purple blue on green blue. Then he turned and looked out the window again, and he saw the ships cruising over the city, gigantic and alien, huge red-gold shapes against a deep red sky. Rash wasn't stupid. He could recognize the incredible when his nose was rubbed in it. Spaceships. Invisible spaceships that he could see only through this alien helmet. Schaefer had been right all along. The killer wasn't human at all. No, not the killer. Killers, plural. He could see 3 ships just from this one window. And he could guess now why the TV reception sucked. Sunspots, my ass, he said softly.